Hey everyone, it's the host of All Across America, Marco Vig, jumping in for a few seconds before the show to thank y'all for listening, to let you know that I want to hear from you. Tell me what you like about the show, and send me your suggestions too. Follow us on Instagram at AllXAmerica, or visit the website, allacrossamerica.net, and you can use our contact page there. If you want to support us, we're on Patreon at patreon.com/allacrossamerica. Try to respond personally to everyone who reaches out, so say hello. All right, on with the show. Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. All right, Suehiko.
All right,
Thank
Mark.
you for being on the show. Really appreciate it. It's great to be here. We're in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, a few miles from the Vermont state line. I want to talk about the cannabis industry, but as I was saying earlier, I wanted to get a sense of your story and hear about your journey, and because I think that gives some context to where you are now.
Great.
So let's hear it. So you were at the Green Gulch Farm in San Francisco. You did that for a number of years, and you were a lawyer. You were out in Sedona. So maybe you can just walk us through, and we got time. So please take your time and let's hear it.
Okay. So I guess Green Gulch, I would back up a little bit. I don't know if you recall, but I was kicked out of high school.
I don't remember that.
Yeah.
I don't remember that.
It's a theme, maybe my karma. Me being the common denominator, it must have something to do with me. So kicked out of high school, and that was actually when I started to really, really fall in love with studying and reading, and wound up going to SUNY Albany and fell in love with philosophy. Western philosophy, mostly American pragmatism, Charles Sanders Peirce, but really, and kind of as I'll tell in this story, I tend to become obsessed with whatever it is that I'm doing at the time. So philosophy was that, and as one does with a philosophy degree, I went to go live at a Zen monastic community, Green Gulch Farm, right out of college. And I went there for the Zen, my interest in Zen practice, which I thought to be less of an intellectual pursuit and more of a practice.
Okay. And Green Gulch is in Marin County, just north of San Francisco.
That's exactly right. Mill Valley, beautiful, idyllic setting.
Yeah. Stinson Beach near there.
Exactly. Yeah. So an organic Chadwick farm, CCOF, certified, third-party organic certified before USDA took it over. And like I said, I went there for the Zen practice and fell in love with agriculture. Didn't know exactly what I wanted to do when I went. I was thinking maybe 6 months, and that turned into 2 years living there, 2 seasons in agriculture and a lot of Zen practice. From there, I went to UC Santa Cruz to the agroecology program to further my studies.
I had a friend that went there.
Yeah.
It's a great town.
Beautiful. So 6 months there, came back to New York to get into agriculture and local farming as sort of a crossroads of many important issues, socially, ecologically, environmentally. And I saw this as a great avenue to participate in these conversations. And the interest was in specifically connecting agriculture to a nonprofit nature preserve in Ossining, New York, Teatown Lake Reservation.
Yes, I know it.
Yep. And the idea is to always figure out ways to help make local farming financially, economically viable, which is a very difficult prospect. Anyone who's ever tried small farming, it's extremely difficult. Any farming is difficult, and the profit margins are slim, and you're competing on a really global market in a lot of cases. So it's a very difficult prospect.
Right.
And
Unless you've got a gentleman farm. And
exactly.
Seems to be a lot of people are doing these days.
They say if you want to make $20,000 farming, all you got to do is invest $5 million.
There's a similar joke for jazz musicians.
Yes, indeed. So with that nonprofit experience, that was what then led me to law school. Backing up, my experience at Green Gulch Farm, which was set up, very interesting setup, both in terms of the culture, the social sort of dynamics, the group structuring, right, and organization. And it really started to get me thinking not just about agriculture, but about alternative ways of organizing human beings into groups, and the ways that those happen, and the way that we've done that as human beings throughout our history. So I became very, very interested in that topic for starting at Green Gulch, and was actually primarily the reason intellectually that I convinced myself to go to law school. And my criteria for law school specifically was that I did not have to go to class, so I could study, self-directed, do whatever I wanted to study, meaning no attendance. You still had to attend the class, and you had to go, there's a core curriculum for law school, and you had to, get decent grades, but you didn't really, there was no attendance requirement. And then the second, that it was in New York, and then third, that I was guaranteed to be able to get a job to pay for my law school loans when I was done, right? And that was my criteria. So I applied to one school, and, as they say, smart enough to get in and dumb enough to go. And so, but really spent my time thinking about alternative organizational structures. I like to say that I was one of the first, if not the first, to think about and try to talk about crowdfunding as a structure. This was before the SEC was even going to begin to allow something like that. But that and a wiki, I was using a wiki platform to create a governance structure.
And what year was this?
I graduated in 2007. So,
okay.
Yeah,
wow.
2000.
So, I mean, we're talking almost a decade before GoFundMe and...
Oh, yeah. And, there was no way to get around the SEC restrictions at that time.
Okay.
This was sort of a little bit before its time in that regard. But, conceptually, it was something that I was thinking about, talking about. I wasn't a programmer, and I never took the time to learn to program. Never got to the tech side. And I couldn't ever convince someone on the tech side to actually program this platform for me. But I sort of used Wiki, the Wiki platform, very minimal to no actual programming. And I used that as a means to coordinate efforts, with varying degrees of success. I learned early the importance of, sort of a core administrative body for any wiki or crowdsourcing crowd. It doesn't just aggregate out of a blob, right? You do need administrative leadership, and I learned that early.
I mean, the Wikipedia Foundation has a lot of staff.
Exactly.
They've got a lot of staff.
Exactly.
And they have a big fundraising operation
Exactly.
as well. Yeah.
Exactly. So it wasn't sort of this self-organizing entity, And I learned that early. Anyway, so that was kind of what I spent most of my time, that and Qigong. So a few strains have been throughout my life, martial arts, meditation, this sort of group organization, and agriculture. Kind of, I would say, really started to become serious for me around Green Gulch time. So from there, graduated law school in 2007 and went to work for Winston & Strawn as a tax attorney, essentially analyzing the tax consequences of various transactions, some, credit default swaps, some international transactions, looking at treaties and the interplay there, and often, basically just analyzing these transactions from the standpoint of the economics and the tax consequences and who's responsible for what liabilities, et cetera. Very fascinating, interesting, but just, fire hose and shitty culture.
Yeah.
I mean, just absolutely terrible. So fortunately for me in some regards, as they say, what doesn't kill you, the economy collapsed, right?
Right. So we're talking 2007,
I graduated
2008,
07.
Great Recession.
Exactly.
So you were working for big law, credit default swaps. You were kind of right in the firing line.
Exactly.
No pun intended.
Yeah. All those derivatives that collapsed the economy. That was basically what I was working on.
Okay. Yeah.
And so again, it was not the culture for me intellectually. It was fascinating, and it was sort of the areas of law that I thought would be interesting to pursue as a career, and also the complexity and the interplay of all these different, the economics and like business purposes and the structuring was all very fascinating. But I was one of the first wave of attorneys to get laid off, first year attorney, and I didn't fit into the culture. So it was, it was obvious. And at the same time, my first wife and I were splitting up.
Okay.
It was very painful, rough experience to say the least. So that was when I moved to Sedona at the end of 2008, Sedona, Arizona, to study martial arts with a guy named Hunter B. Armstrong.
And that's at the Spartan Training Center.
Spartan Training Center, yeah, right in the heart of Sedona. I went and I slept in the closet of the Spartan Training Center for.
Yeah, you could see on your Substack, you got the traditional bunk beds.
Yep.
It's for real.
No, it was rough. It was rough, and took a certain amoup of pride in how Spartan it really was.
That's right. I mean, it lived up to its name.
It certainly did.
It's no bait and switch.
Nope. No, it was definitely not a comfortable, lush experience. I often joke. I remember after a few months of living there, like just the feeling of taking my shoes off and putting my feet on a carpet was like luxurious.
Small things.
Yeah. So yeah, lived there. I was planning on actually transitioning into law enforcement. I was really starting to identify with the sort of warrior culture, more like a LARPing wannabe warrior culture. From my standpoint, was not a professional, never military or anything like that, but was interested in pursuing going into law enforcement. So I had applications actually in NYPD, Westchester County PD, LA, San Francisco, Arizona.
Oh, wow.
Never got a call back.
From any of those?
Never once.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, was it because it was the Great Recession and so many people were looking
I think
for
that was part of it.
Yeah,
I think that was part of it. I always wonder, because a few months when I was in law school, I started thinking about FBI as a potential.
Right, a lot of lawyers go into the FBI.
Yeah, exactly.
I know one.
Yeah, and the FBI always wants a specialized degree, and law is one of them. And I'll never forget. So I was more interested in the exciting, sort of aspects of it. I wanted to get on a tactical team. That was my aspiration back then, and so through the people that I was meeting, training, because I met Hunter Armstrong my second year of law school, and started training and getting into that community, from the outside around then. And he has a lot of connections, primarily through the Marine Corps. And then the Marines in Quantico do a lot of work with FBI. So I used one of my contacts and wrote this very honest letter to somebody who was in FBI and their tactical team, high up, and explained to him, that when you do background check, you'll find marijuana use, and I just don't lie. I'm going to be honest, and I always wonder whether that had any influence. So we'll see. It was either that or the Great Recession, but I never got a call back.
Okay.
Yeah. So I slept on the cot in the training center at the Spartan Training Center. I was 3 months was my plan. This was the end of 2008. Wife was on the way out, and so that turned into a year. And after a year of roofing in Sedona, Arizona, in Arizona.
So you were doing for a roofing contractor.
For a roofing contractor.
All right, that's a hot place to be. It's a little bit warmer than Phoenix, Tucson, or a little bit cooler, but not by much.
Not by
We're
much.
Not talking
not by much.
Yeah.
No. So early morning hours, still brutal. By noon in the summertime, it's torture. Pretty sure I almost died a few times. I got, hats off, man. There's some tough people.
Yeah.
Arizona roofers, man. So the industry in Sedona is tourism, right? And so I was meeting people, and they suggested, hey, why don't you try timeshare sales? So I, gave it a crack. That was started in 2009, after about a year of living in Sedona on the cot. And turned out that, I was pretty good at it. And so that then became the way that I supported my habit of martial arts. I basically was part of a cult for 10 years living in Sedona. We trained 5 to 20 hours a week religiously.
For 10 years.
For 10 years. and timeshare was fantastic in that it supported my habit, and great lifestyle. I mean, I took probably a week off once a month, generally for more intensive training that we would do, and it was an interesting juxtaposition. I learned so much, right? Sales, and in particular timeshare sales, is a fascinating industry. And, to be honest, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's extremely high of absolute just pathological criminal fraud.
Right, people, yes. And you talked about being a good salesman is having people make a purchase which they're happy about and don't regret. And it sounds like a lot of the people you work with didn't care one way or the other.
No. It was a culture where truth just was irrelevant. And it always caused me a lot of turmoil, internal, psychological, emotional, spiritual turmoil. And, in various ways, I tried to bring it to the higher ups and to the executives, and they didn't want to hear it.
They want to know about the numbers.
They just want to know about sales numbers. And, what I found was fascinating is that it is possible to be a good salesman and to be very honest, right? To be painfully honest. And that became sort of my style.
Okay.
Was to be, shockingly honest about everything. And so it was an interesting experience. I've talked to probably 3,000 people over the 9 years that I was doing that. And juxtaposed with this training that, I took very, very seriously, the martial arts training and the culture of the people that came through. You talked about sort of Sedona, a very hippie, spiritual place, and that was, Spartan Training Center was a oasis of non-spiritual, non-hippie
discipline.
Very disciplined, very influenced by military culture.
Okay.
My Chip Hunter Armstrong's best and closest friends were all Marine Corps. Very high level Marine Corps career, Marine Corps, and so that heavily influenced the culture of the Spartan Training Center. And so that juxtaposition, and these were men of extraordinary honor and integrity, the cream of the crop, and not to over romanticize military, because, to be clear, there's a lot of people in the military who are not this caliber. I don't know, again, percentages, I don't claim to, but
well, million strong, so there's always going to be.
Exactly. So that was my life for 10 years.
And you think about, you talk about the juxtaposition. It is kind of like the antidote to sales and that kind of culture of dishonesty. And, you think about the discipline and the training. And, there's nothing more honest and straightforward than getting, kicked in the face.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yep. That direct feedback mechanism is very, very important for a number of reasons. And, in retrospect, what I've realized is, you take this meandering path that I've been explaining here, and excuse me, there's the way that I now make sense of it in retrospect is that there's two, let's call it overarching principles that explain how I've spent my adult life from the time I was 19, 20 years old, and that is effectiveness and well-being. So effectiveness I define as the ability to take an abstract conceptual idea, right, a fantasy in your mind, and to make it reality, or to make it some semblance of reality, at least resembling the model that you had in your mind. So that's effectiveness,
okay.
The ability to get stuff done in the world. The other is well-being. Now, well-being is a lot more complicated, but it has to do with things like meaning. It has to do with happiness in a broad sense, not necessarily, the sort of, let's call it the hedonistic, fulfillment of desires, but more happiness in a broader sense, right? And a more, I would say, balanced way, right?
They're symbiotic too. Happiness and getting stuff done.
Well, and what's interesting, they are. And in fact, what I've now come to believe wholeheartedly, and this is what this is really the thing that I harp on, the only thing that I harp on with my kids, is twofold. One, the foundation of our effectiveness and well-being from the standpoint of the individual is grounded in the very simple act of learning to relax and control your muscles, relax and control your breath, and stay focused so that when you get distracted in the practice of relaxing your muscles and controlling your breath, you bring it back. Now, there's certain layers on top of that, all kind of comes from the Eastern technology. There's practices, things like non-judgmental awareness, equanimity, compassion, right? So these are just layers that you build and cultivate on top of it. But the foundation is quite literally the ability to relax and focus. That is the core foundation for the individual effectiveness and well-being, right? Then, as the sort of understanding us as evolved as group hunting mammals over tens of thousands, millions of years, depending how far back you go back, the foundation of our effectiveness and well-being is us integrated within groups. So that then, in retrospect, and there's always a lot more order to the chaos in retrospect as we tell our stories, but that is sort of helps me to understand what has driven me and what I've become obsessed with over the, past 20 some years. So that sort of, that focus there, really, I think, back to your point about the juxtaposition and, taking that, I'd say, one level of abstraction downstream, I believe that all human flourishing and creativity, which I think is ultimately the meaning of life, flourishing and creativity, again, effectiveness and well-being, just another way of saying that.
Fair enough.
Is really what some call flow states. I think that's a little overly broad and in its application, but the various types of flow states, right? And human beings as individuals and groups in flow states is, in my estimation, the foundation of all human flourishing and well-being. And this flow states, as described subjectively, is very much about, us in our most, our best performance within that context, as well as the best experience. Again, effectiveness and well-being. And so some of the characteristics that are required for flow state to kick in, right, is a very, very tight feedback mechanism, right, between the activity that you're engaging in and whether or not it is effective. Now, when you're, in a sparring type of position and getting hit with sticks instantaneously, there's a direct feedback mechanism constantly. So, once you get past certain stages, flow state becomes a very common aspect within martial arts training. One may say the desired outcome, again, the foundation of the effectiveness, right, is this flow state. And then to go to work in sales, it requires a very similar type of, let me say that, analogous flow state. Right? There's a direct feedback mechanism and being able to observe the nonverbal cues and understand, because ultimately sales is about communication.
100%.
Right. So yeah, and during this time, while living in Sedona and training and doing the sales as sort of my income, also feeling quite a bit of emotional and spiritual, psychological turmoil over a lot of the behavior, again, what I took to just be straight criminal fraud. And really I was countercultural in that regard within the timeshare world. There are a few honest timeshare salesmen, but let's just say it's a very small group.
Okay.
At least that was my experience. So, I was always in the back of my mind, again, very interested in the idea of community building. We'll say that broadly, right? Group organization, human beings working within groups, and agriculture.
Okay.
And cannabis, to me, always seemed like the just absolutely obvious intersection. And it's not that the cannabis industry in and of itself is going to save small farms, although that argument has been made and it will be a help. But what I imagine what cannabis can do is, number one, attract. So there's an enormous amount of capital being deployed into cannabis, especially into the cultivation side. What I would like to see is that capital deployed onto existing food producing farms. And then the revenue, of course, right? So it's a huge amount of revenue that's coming even at the agriculture, say, the cultivation side of the supply chain. And then the cultural attention, right? The extraordinary amount of cultural energy that's around cannabis and the end of prohibition. And the number of very real conversations that converge on the intersection between cannabis and small farms, right? So you take, and one of the things I try to be very careful about is, in the use of language and the use of concepts and overly doing concepts. So racism is a very real part of our society, but we've kind of swung on the pendulum where culturally racism has become the explanation for everything, so that it loses its value as an explanatory framework when it's everything. However, when you look at the history of the Controlled Substance Act and marijuana in the United States and the illegality, there is really no other way to read it other than systemic, brutal, institutionalized racism, right? Using of a plant which we have shown to be essentially benign, especially when you compare it to other, intoxicants or even, sugar, the role that sugar plays in our society and culture and health. It's completely benign. Now, I'm not saying there aren't trade-offs and that it's a cure of all things. Again, I try to be very careful about.
Right. It's a drug.
Right. So, and there are some very promising medical benefits, right? And no doubt about any of that. But the bottom line is it should never have been illegal. And with the sanctions and the criminal, just the destruction of entire communities. So it's very real, and it's very, very blatant, and it's actually, it's been explicit, right? If you look again at the history of the Controlled Substance Act in the early 70s and the communications around that, it was very explicit.
The Nixon administration,
exactly.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of that was made
exactly.
public. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's horrible. It's just horrible. And you take that plus the sustainability conversation around cultivation, especially cultivation indoors and the energy usage. Massachusetts, for example, and don't quote these. I mean, I guess you are quoting it, but some estimate that 10% of industrial electrical use in Massachusetts is now used for marijuana cultivation.
It's on the Bitcoin scale almost.
Exactly. Indoor cultivation is extremely energy intensive,
Right.
and then depending on the cultivation techniques you use, if it's hydroponic, then it's very water intensive and a lot of petrochemical fertilizers and inputs with the resulting runoff and nitrification of water and all these issues that are around agriculture, and it's sort of exacerbated on an indoor cannabis cultivation. That plus the role that agriculture itself plays in economies and health, and what could potentially be a solution to some of the way agriculture has kind of gone off the rails, and I don't think that was not so much a concerted conspiracy per se, like, for example, the Controlled Substance Act, but in agriculture, we went towards this very specialized, highly consolidated agricultural system, international on a global scale, which has led to a lot of trade-offs and downstream costs, right? Environmental in particular, food health, some argue, right? The quality of the food has suffered. And then, of course, we just absolutely crush our food system and health by focusing too much on production of particular macronutrients and sugar. A lot of corn for ethanol,
right.
For fuel, but the amount of sugar that we've put into our food system and subsidize it in every which direction is just, I won't call it criminal, but it's close to on par with, let's say, some of the problems we see in pharmaceuticals related to all of the opioids. And it's definitely, I wouldn't say that people set out on a beginning with some criminal conspiracy scheme, but let's just say that they now see it and they benefit from it and don't care, right? Don't care enough to change multi-trillion-dollar industries. So one of the solutions in agriculture, potentially, and again, this is an empirical question, to be seen, that takes experimentation, but local agriculture. You can produce things, let's say, a much more ethical foundation.
So you're talking more. You're an advocate for outdoor growing of marijuana as opposed to the indoor growing.
That's right.
I mean, I'm thinking probably the Hepworth sisters are a perfect example of that. That had been. I mean, I don't know. Amy Hepworth has been in farming for 5 generations. I forget. I was a member of the Park Slope Food Co-op in Brooklyn for 10 years. So
okay.
I mean, a lot of her vegetables over there. There's many different varieties of vegetables.
Yes.
I mean, that's what she's been well known for.
Exactly.
But now branching out into marijuana cultivation.
Yeah, and to be even more specific, the interest is not just outdoor cultivation, but cannabis cultivation integrated into food farms as part of a agricultural system, right? An integrated, diversified food production farm.
Okay.
Exactly like the Hepworth sisters. This 8th generation farm. Amy Hepworth has been farming now for, farming this land for 40 plus years. And so the idea is to really take that expertise, that know-how, that understanding of how to scale and do it organically, right? They're an organic farm. And she's really a thought leader. Amy Hepworth is a thought leader in that regard.
Just for folks that's in the Hudson Valley. I'm not. It's upstate Catskill, Hudson Valley area.
Right along. It's literally on the Hudson River.
It is.
Their property's on the Hudson River in Milton, Ulster County. So about 10 minutes south of Poughkeepsie, right along the Hudson. All right. And their farm. This is an 8th generation farm, the Hepworth farm. And Amy and her twin sister Gail. And they've been farming this particular farm and providing for Park Slope Food Co-op and Whole Foods and Fresh Direct and Food Bank, and they give a lot. And the thesis, my thinking has always been, and this is almost a tautology, but sometimes it needs to be said. When there are large, when I say large, I mean it's small relative to what's considered a large farm in the United States, right? Thousands of acres. So it's a small farm, 500 acres. But it's large relative to what I'll call sort of the post 60s, 70s, back to the land, small farm, right?
The homesteader variety, and they sell a little bit of vegetables at the farmer's market on
Sunday. Which, some people might get mad if they hear me say this, but I just don't think is very economically viable model.
It's not. I mean, you can't feed a population of 300 plus million with essentially gentleman farms.
Exactly. Now you get to what the Hepworth sisters are doing, and now you're talking. Right. Now you're cooking. And so to be able to integrate cannabis into that existing infrastructure and network with the scale of the equipment, right? The trained.
I mean, a tractor alone could be 150, 200 plus $1,000.
Exactly. And you take a harvester and a tractor, and then all the storage and the refrigeration, and then the trucking and the self-distribution, right? Not to mention the trained staff, right? The workers. And so, that integration was actually why I decided. So, back to Sedona. The last time I talked to Chip Hunter Armstrong was in March of 2018. And that's when I told him that my intention was to come to Massachusetts, where it was the first to become legal recreationally. That was very important for me, recreation as opposed to the medical, for a number of reasons. And that it allowed, the regulations were written such that you could do it outdoor on farms. So I told him this, and after 14 years, and essentially gave me an ultimatum, which was either do not do that. This is not something that somebody within our tradition does. Selling intoxicants, especially to the weak-minded, that was the way he put it, is just not acceptable. So I can either not pursue that or not train anymore. So that was about a 15-minute conversation. And the last time I spoke with him, it's painful, without a doubt. And for me, all human knowledge, all models, all sort of symbolic language and the way we model the world sort of mediated through all of those language and mathematics is all downstream, in my opinion, of epistemology, right? A theory of knowledge and how we come to know what we know. Now, most people don't think about that at all. And so probably 85% of human beings, their entire epistemology is based on emotion and feeling and cues primarily from their in-group, right? From their social group. That's where their beliefs come from. Tell me somebody's zip code, and I'll probably tell you their position on gun ownership or abortion.
Right.
Right. And so from that standpoint, I think I generally don't hold as much value in my precious ideas as maybe some do. And so don't get me wrong, there are some ideas that I hold very, very precious, right? For example, epistemological perspectives, right? Fallibilism, the general worldview about the limitations of what we can actually know. But my point here is integrated into that worldview must be a scientific and experimental disposition, right? Not an absolutist, I know what is right, but a mechanism, again, effectiveness and well-being.
You talked a lot about continuous self-improvement and growth. It sounds like that's a part of that.
Exactly. And one of that is requirement, absolutely requirement, is a society based on liberty. And this was something, John Stuart Mill has been a huge influence of mine, on liberty, lays this out perfectly. And it's this idea that human beings must have the ability to act based on their own free will or agency, let's call it, whatever. We could talk about whether
agency is the modern term.
Yes,
for
yeah. And so you have to have the freedom to do that. You just absolutely must. And if you're not causing harm to others, then you should have the freedom to do that. And that is a non-negotiable principle for me, right? And people could hold whatever opinions they want on things like abortion, but these are all downstream, right? My belief in pluralistic worldviews is downstream from an epistemology, because no one has absolute access to, God's will and understanding of all humanity and morality.
Right.
That's just wrong.
And you look at science, and we're in the 21st century, and people forget that there will be 22nd century science and 23rd century science, and what we know today might seem, stupid in 100 years from now.
That is what you just said is an expression of this fallibilist epistemology and worldview. Now, this is important in this context because when I was given this ultimatum, I was being asked by somebody that I respected and loved dearly, but nevertheless, to replace my judgment with his. And he was just wrong. Wrong on a economic, political, social, and ethical stance. And primarily, the most important ethical stance is the individual's right to freedom and liberty and self-determination and to create a life that makes the most sense based on their own perspective and judgment and worldview. So that was the end of that, and I came out to Massachusetts specifically, and I actually I filmed myself for various reasons. I thought maybe becoming more outspoken on social media would be a way to integrate a marketing aspect to to this drive. And so I started, but it was also, again, my commitment to these epistemological perspectives. I filmed myself, in the mystery of agency of like, what is it and how does it work? Like, how does an abstraction in the mind become reality? And so I started filming myself, basically my commitment to come to Massachusetts and connect cannabis to farms as a means to attract the capital and the revenue and the cultural attention and the integration of all of these aspects, these very important parts of both the history of prohibition, right, the Controlled Substance Act, and then the sustainability and food production and local agriculture. Started EOS Farms in Massachusetts. We were the 5th licensed outdoor cultivator. Now, at the time, it was very contrarian. And all of the smart money that I talked to, when I did have the opportunity to talk to the smart money, and, with huge air quotes, they were all convinced that you cannot grow plants outdoors in Massachusetts. That's what they had heard in, their conversations.
I mean,
in
they
bars.
denying agriculture it exists in Massachusetts.
Well, again, back to the models and epistemology and cognitive dissonance and all the things that, lead to our beliefs, right? And so the core belief among the people who had invested in cannabis up to that point was that you can't grow cannabis outside. And even if you could, no one wants it and the quality's not as good, right? And so it was very contrarian, couldn't raise any capital, and had to get very creative in how to finance this operation, because I certainly did not have enough money to do it on my own. Perhaps in retrospect, I could have bootstrapped it more. Maybe I should have. Who knows? But, that was the plan. 2022, and New York opens up. And in particular, the rollout is specifically giving first mover advantage to outdoor cultivators. If you were a hemp cultivator licensed in New York to grow hemp for, I think, 2 of the previous 5 years, then you could apply for a very simple application to become a THC cannabis cultivator in 2022. So plus or minus 240 applicants went in and got licensure. And it was shocking to me. I mean, what I had to do in Massachusetts in order to touch my first seed relative to what the New Yorkers got was, it was baffling to me. Right?
Wow. And just so people understand, you're not on the dispensary side. You're on the cultivation side.
Cultivation,
of things, so.
up through, all the consumer products, the packaging, into the distribution.
Okay.
Right. And that's again, going back to the Hepworth sisters, right? They had years of experience in large scale agriculture, processing, storage, and self-distribution.
So everything from growing the vegetable to getting it in a box and shipping it to the store, and then it gets taken over by the retailer to the end user.
Exactly. And in New York, they're very, very strict in the separation between retail and every other aspect of the supply chain. So there's not really
a vertical...
Can't be fully vertically integrated in New York by design. And they're very, very serious about that and very strict.
And why is that? And do you think New York State learned a lot from states like Massachusetts that were, the first in the Northeast?
There's various justifications for it. Actually, this model is more coming out of Washington State, and it sort of takes some cues from alcohol, right? The 3-tier system in alcohol, right? You can't be a distributor and a sales, and you can't have the retail and distribution and production. They want to separate out those 3 tiers of the supply chain because they don't want a monopoly.
When you said Washington State, I thought apples. New York and Washington State are the 2 biggest apple producers in the country.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. But Washington, adult use cannabis is structured in similar, and so a lot of cues came from there. Other states as well, but a lot of the structure in New York came from the Washington State structure. There's arguments. I understand the argument. I think, this again, my political views and my epistemology tend to be in tension often. And so, there was times when I sort of flirted with very hardcore libertarian perspectives on economics, but I do think, there is a role to be played for adjusting and correcting and, pushing and using regulatory framework to push towards various outcomes. But
it's like anything. I mean, there's there's a centrist view, and sometimes it becomes reactionary
Yeah.
when you talk about regulations, and then there's the opposite side of things. I know you had written about microbe testing in Massachusetts,
That's
and
right.
obviously that's important, but are you over testing in a way?
Well, and that's exactly it. Is I hold open the possibility in the conversation in principle, but in my direct experience in any industry, I have never seen it work. Frankly, if I'm just being honest, in Massachusetts, regulations are terrible and they push everything in the wrong direction. New York, same. I mean, there are some improvements, and what shocks me about New York is some of the people in the OCM, in the state agency, and their ethical and sort of their perspective and where they want to see this industry go is shocking to me, and just how amazing, actually.
Okay.
It's very encouraging. But no state agency is a monolith. There is no specific clear intention, right? You have human beings, and then you have human beings who frankly don't understand the industry. Again, New York was different. Massachusetts, you had, as far as I could tell, no one who understood the industry. Yeah. New York, at least, they did have. They brought on a lot of subject matter experts who really helped to inform the direction. But you still have a lot of politics, a lot of fear. The hangover from prohibition. Hence that microbe testing issue is just completely. It's framed completely incorrectly, in my perspective. And so, a lot of the regulations have such unintended consequences that are in just the absolutely wrong direction. And so, again, I do understand and I believe in principle, that there is a place. I've just never, in my direct experience, seen it work well, which I don't know what to do with that information.
I mean, I just look at the whole why I got interested in is that, here's this economic lesson in real time. You've got this pent up demand for something, boom, within a couple of years, you have a fresh new market that never existed, and just seeing the different states and their regulatory approach to it. And, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal last year about Oklahoma. And of course, they've got a very, very different and much more free market inclined approach. And they have 2,600 dispensaries that sprung up within a couple of years, and 10% of the state population has a medical marijuana card. It's not legal there for recreational use, but 10% of the population. And this was in the Wall Street Journal, and they had to stop, the dispensaries because there were too many of them. And then you have a state like Massachusetts that, it was the exact opposite approach. They basically gave a monopoly to some of the early, starters, in that, these dispensaries would be one dispensary for 50 miles. And, now on my drive up here to Great Barrington through there, that must have passed 10 dispensaries in 20 miles.
Yeah. Yeah, Massachusetts, people are complaining a lot about the New York rollout, that's very slow. And there's a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is the application process takes time, and it relies on responses from humans who, also take time. But then there's also other things, other forces on the outside. There was an injunction which slowed out the retail rollout for months.
And that was the veterans lawsuit.
Yeah, the veterans were the front men for it, but there were other. Let's say the resources came from elsewhere.
Okay. And can you talk a little bit about that lawsuit and how it stalled?
Yeah, so one of the restrictions in cannabis, it's still federally illegal, and it's heavily regulated within the states where it is legal, some more than others, as you were saying. And so you can only sell your product legally to a licensed outlet, right? And in New York, for example, in New York City, I've heard upwards of 2,000 illegal non-licensed stores, which are mostly indistinguishable, especially to the average consumer. And there were hopes that there was an application process in New York, and it was this conditional adult use retail dispensary, and you had to be justice impact. You had all these different criteria, right. And so it was a limited pool, but the rollout hit a number of snafus, right? One of them was that there was supposed to be a pool of financing that really, just petered out and never really happened the way it was meant to happen. Okay. So there was very little financing for these card applicants once they did get the license. And then, more recently, there was this injunction. a claim of overstep by the OCM, basically violation of the Constitution in their power, and basically giving this priority to card applicants and not giving it to veterans, which
And who is the OCM?
Office of Cannabis Management,
Okay.
the New York agency that oversees all of the adult use and now medical cannabis. And so, this rollout then was stopped by a court injunction that stopped the opening of additional retail licenses. And, so that for up until 2 weeks ago, there were only 26 licensed retail stores
In the state of New York.
in the state of New York, right? 20 million people.
Giant state. I mean,
Giant
8 hours
state.
between Buffalo and Brooklyn.
Exactly. 26 licensed stores. So you had 240 cultivators, right, that were given licenses that grew, somewhere in the ballpark of 200 to 400,000 pounds of total biomass of material.
You couldn't do anything with.
Couldn't do anything with. That's about, depending on how you break it up and what you think the size of a retail store on average would be, for the amount of cannabis that was grown, you would have needed somewhere in the ballpark of 100 stores open for a year, not 10, 26, right?
And marijuana has a shelf life. It's not like maple syrup where they've got a strategic maple syrup reserve in a warehouse in
exactly.
Ottawa or wherever,
Now, that's where having a processor licensing, be able to convert it to some of its more shelf-stable formats.
Okay, edibles, something. Okay.
Now, and shelf life and stability on cannabis and flower is also an ongoing debate and is largely driven by marketing. It is a storage crop, and it does store. And in fact, the Rastas, Michael Hart, who's our VP of cultivation in New York at the Hepworth Pura, he's just a bona fide, genuine, one of the most incredible human beings I've ever met. Michael Hart is a Rasta. Mm-hmm. He's been around the plant since he was 12 years old, growing up in Jamaica, growing it and around it. And, to them, from his perspective, you don't ever want to smoke cannabis that isn't cured and aged, right? They don't want the fresh stuff, right? To them, they want cured, and well cured. We're talking months, 6 months plus. So the whole freshness is a conversation that's important, and there are different perspectives, but it's largely subjective. And, I've seen research showing, stored at the right conditions, and that's the key, too. You need infrastructure, right conditions. But, I've seen some research showing, 300 days with zero degradation of the molecules that we care about.
Okay.
Anyway, that's digression. The point is, the New York rollout and this injunction really slowed the process because the entire industry is downstream of retail. And if you only have 26 outlets,
that's it. Yeah.
That's it.
Particularly when you can't vertically align.
And in particular, when you have 1,000 illegal, non-licensed that are direct competition and are indistinguishable from the standpoint of the consumer.
I mean, you're almost greenlighting the black market in many respects.
Exactly. And, I understand the perspective, right? Because this is the end of prohibition, and New York has a very scattered past, to say the least, with the Rockefeller laws and, and incarcerating, just destroying communities over cannabis. And so they don't want to go back to that and start, imposing criminal sanctions on people for selling non-licensed. But, it's a question, like how do you, especially when you take the tax, the taxes are a huge disadvantage in the legal industry.
They're about 20%.
20% at the retail level, but that doesn't actually include the THC tax, which happens at distribution. And the THC tax is based on the, let's say, equivalent of grams or milligrams of THC in the product. So to give you an idea, if we sell, let's call it a $5, 1 gram pre-roll marijuana flower cigarette, right? Cannabis flower cigarette. And we sell that for $5 to $7, and that's got 1 gram and 20% THC. At $5, that's $1. That's a $1 at the distribution on a $5 to $7 wholesale unit. That is the THC tax goes to the state. Then that goes to the retailer, and the retailer generally doubles that, right? They keystone it. They take that 5 to 7 and they double it and sell it at 10 to 14 at retail. Then
you're getting 20% on that.
Then you get the 20%. You get the sales tax, the use tax, and then the 13% excise tax at retail for cannabis. So to compete with that on a market where there's no taxes, no sanctions, you can't distinguish it. There's a store on every corner in Manhattan, and then there's only 26. Makes it challenging.
It makes it challenging.
Yeah.
Particularly when consumers don't know. It's
no idea.
Yeah.
No idea.
Yeah.
And there are a lot, there's heavy restrictions on the marketing and advertising and signage and all that if you're doing it in a compliant way. So you basically have to not advertise that you're selling it, whereas these illegal shops in New York, they got neon lights and
oh wow,
yeah, bring the kids in here. We got candy for them also. I mean, it's just completely
it's
opportunist, terrible.
Massachusetts. I mean, there are billboards right on the highway for all the dispensaries, and
yeah.
it doesn't seem to be the case in New York. And I mean, I know with alcohol, for instance, when I lived in New Orleans, it'd be advertisements for vodka right on the highway. You know, don't you wish your commute was so smooth? Literally, and I'm like, it's a bottle of vodka, and I'm driving 80 miles an hour in the middle of New Orleans. You can't do that up this way. But so you're saying in New York State, the advertising restrictions are stronger,
very strong. And in Massachusetts, when it first rolled out, you couldn't have billboards. And in New York, clearly, you cannot have billboards. Massachusetts, you now can, but Massachusetts didn't have the problem when they rolled out of having 4,000 illegal stores to compete with. And so you have like Theory Wellness in Great Barrington, what I call the Theory Wellness phenomenon, right? In the first year, this was interesting. I remember when they opened up, and the question was, and in retrospect, I predicted they were going to do very well. I don't think anyone predicted they were going to do as well as they did in their first year. Right, probably $30 million of revenue,
and they were the only one. They were one of the first ones in Western Massachusetts, right on the New York border,
right, and they had no competition. And the location was perfect.
Like I said, it was essentially a monopoly for them for a couple of years.
Right now, my guess is they're probably doing 10 million. 1/3 of what they did in their first year.
Okay.
Again, I'd have to look at the more closely, but that would be my guess just off the top of my head, right? And then, of course, losing some of that business to now New York, right? Probably 30% of the customers in Massachusetts were from bordering states in the first couple of years, right? Now, I think what's happening in Massachusetts is as the price drops and convenience, and there are more outlets in Massachusetts, that price drop is now starting to allow the legal market to dip into the home grow and the legacy markets in Massachusetts. And so we are seeing actually total volume of sales continue to rise, not at the same rate, but it's not going down the way that the price is going down. So I think that thesis is sound. And then, but in New York, it's a different animal. It's we're going directly into strict, strong competition with the legacy market. That's a little bit generous.
What do you mean by legacy?
Legacy meaning the operators who were previously operating in the non-licensed, illegal market. Legacy,
so the black market,
the black market,
yeah.
Right?
Okay.
It's just different terminology, and so that. I think there is some of that in New York, but the vast majority of these stores are opportunists. These weren't people who were in it. They just realize now there's no sanctions. They can do whatever they want, and they can make a buck. So they're not really legacy. They're just opportunists and, quite frankly, very irresponsible and unethical in some cases.
Likely move on to the next thing.
Exactly.
5-10 years down the road. Yeah.
Exactly. So, but doesn't change the basics, of the landscape, and that's what we have to contend with in New York. This time 3 years, 36 months from now, there will be probably 200 to 300 stores licensed in New York. At that point, it will be a vibrant market. They got to do something about that THC tax I just described. That's just absolutely killer and non-workable. And quite frankly, again, this goes back to my views on regulation and, just busybody do-gooder politicians. Ultimately, I'm sure their hearts are in the right place, right? Now, the THC tax really wasn't. That was a holdover from the previous administration and their prohibitionist tendencies. But that THC tax, people wonder, well, what should we do and how should we regulate? And at the end of the day, I'm not a fan of now again imposing criminal sanctions on people for selling cannabis illegally, but instead of spending all the administrative, judicial resources to try to impose or to enforce sanctions on the illegal, they could just get rid of that tax, and that alone would just work wonders to help the legal market compete with the illegal, right? Just basic economics.
Yeah.
Take away that 20% tax at distribution that we're forced to pay on top of the 20% tax at retail.
And that doesn't happen in Massachusetts.
That, fortunately, does not happen in Massachusetts.
So in Mass, it's only on the retail end, that 20%.
Now,
so
there's still that huge, unjustifiable, exorbitant tax in Massachusetts, but it doesn't have the additional,
I see.
That at the distribution level, ridiculous tax.
I mean,
imposed.
that's a fair argument. You've got a neighboring state, you've got Connecticut, you've got Mass, New Jersey, for instance. So it's hard to turn off that tap. But if it's the same thing with clothing sales tax.
Yeah.
People will go to Jersey to buy clothing because they weren't paying that. Let me ask you this about the black market. I mean, will it dwindle to the point where it's almost dead? I mean, look at alcohol, for instance. I mean, you got home brewers, you've got, maybe a few scattered moonshiners in southern Appalachia, but I mean, nobody's making their own gin.
Yeah.
Their own, at what point does it, and what does it take to get there to where the black market is no longer?
Yeah. I mean, it just comes down to basic economics: price, consistency, value, right? Yeah. And so, again, when I started in this industry and I, air quote the hell out of smart money, the basic premise of the smart money was this idea that you could model a business around, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 wholesale pounds of marijuana, cannabis. And it's an agricultural crop. And again, people get very uptight when you say that. Oh, no, it's not. I grow the very best, bombest, firest, greatest genetics that have ever existed.
It's still a crop.
Still a crop.
Still got to water it and, needs sunlight.
Yep. And it's driven by agricultural economics. Full stop. Now, you can use other strategies, and this is what the smart money has tried in other states: lobby for state-imposed monopolies. And if I have a state-imposed monopoly, then maybe long enough I will be able to sell the flower at wholesale $2,000 to $3,000, $4,000 a pound and recoup my exorbitant capex to build out these facilities.
So in other words, they're trying to lobby for a cartel.
Exactly. State-imposed monopoly, right? Limited license is one approach to this business model, okay? That's not how it's working in New York, and this is one of the reasons people are very, very upset, right? So that's one strategy, and that was, the early phase strategy in Massachusetts. And so you had these large, very well-funded operations that built out these, $500 to $1,000 a square foot indoor grow facilities. You do the math on that, 100,000 square feet, that's $50 to $100 million build out, right, on 100,000 square feet. No one actually built out. And, of course, a lot of that smart money are now shutting down those grow facilities in Massachusetts. EOS Farm stands as proof of concept. Low-cost outdoor cultivation infrastructure we can support and sell it at a much lower cost because we can produce it at a much lower cost because we don't have lights and HVAC, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that model, though, is wrong. It's just pure wrong. That limited license, non-competitive monopoly model is just wishful thinking and hope. And what we've seen is it doesn't last very long. And ultimately, what's going to happen is compete. So your question, how does the black market, what happens? Why don't you see moonshiners anymore? You can grow tomatoes in your own backyard, but what percentage of people grow tomatoes? And why? Well, it comes to a point where you can get the efficiencies, you can get the scale, you can get the quality and the consistency with then a brand behind that communicates to the consumer so that they have that ability to anticipate and to trust what's coming. And then eventually the cost structure is such that it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there's more utility to just buy it off a grocery shelf.
Exactly. Now, will will somebody's uncle and cousin and mom, and will they grow tomatoes in the backyard still? Yeah, absolutely. I do. I prefer them, usually, right? We still buy a shit ton of tomatoes from the Hepworths.
Well, I mean, it's hard to do in January,
Exactly. So, I mean, I think ultimately, what we set out to build, and what now I'm participating with the Hepworth Pura, is building a industry that actually is in harmony, right, and is actually works with the agricultural economics, as opposed to going with the ostrich effect and hoping for a monopoly long enough that I can recoup the ridiculous investment that I made on an indoor cultivation. Now, there will always be a place for that, I'm sure. I don't know about always, but there will probably be a place for it, right? And what the Pacific Northwest, the Emerald Triangle, Be Real in particular, did a really interesting job of branding around the indoor aesthetic of cannabis, right? But outdoor cannabis is actually better, but only by measurable, objective standards, right? So that shit just doesn't matter to most people. But in the things that matter, in terms of experience and environmental costs, right? The THC is not as high generally, but there's what's called the entourage effect. So the actual, psychoactive molecules are in the hundreds, right? The minor cannabinoids and the terpenes and the way they interact with each other and your biochemistry is what gives you the experience. So THC is only one factor. So the minor cannabinoids, oxidation levels, terpenes, they're all better outdoors, right? Then, of course, the cost structure and then the sustainability and environmental costs, it's just better, right? And so the truth does come out, but there will probably be, a role for indoor craft, like people who really, really just get into the cultivation of individual small batch plants, But as far as the basic infrastructure, it's an agricultural crop. So building it around those principles is what's going to allow a vibrant, long-term, sustainable industry.
I mean, and is that possible in all 50 states?
No. I mean, yes and no.
Can you grow marijuana outdoors in all 50 states? I'd imagine you could.
Yeah. I mean, there's some states actually in the southern states where it's like super hot.
Oh, so it's almost too hot.
Yeah. But again, all of the genetics, all the best and the brightest minds, everyone was focusing on indoor, right? For a long time.
So there's a lag.
There's a lag. And so there needs to be best practices, regionally, as well as, genetics that are actually bred specific to the conditions of the environment. And that's the beauty of the plant, is it, you can breed it to be successful,
right,
within, various climates.
I mean, same thing as wine.
Right. Exactly. Now, will it be in every 50 state? I'm sure there will be to some degree, but then there will be, specialization. There will be some states that produce it more than others and better than others, I'm sure. But again, that will come down to genetics and best practices. And again, all the smart money was telling me in 2017 how you can't grow it in the Northeast. And it's not without challenges, don't get me wrong. And some of the challenges were largely imposed by regulators who have no clue what they're doing, right? So there were artificially imposed challenges in some regards, but some of it is real, weather and moisture and humidity. These are things you have to contend with. Short seasons, right? These are all issues. But, at the end of the day, there are different characteristics that come out of each, right? I am personally a big fan of local agriculture as a general, sort of baseline perspective, right? But that's not a solution for everywhere, right? One of the human beings are very well adapted and they can live in any climate, even if you can't necessarily grow stuff, right? So, I think that it's more complicated than, will it be in all 50 states? But it certainly can be more than one state.
And then that also destroys the black market as well. I mean, getting back to the Oklahoma thing, if all the states surrounding you are, illegal, if all the states are surrounding you then become legal, then that kind of destroys the black market as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's that cross border issue, which will eventually go away, I presume, at some point, and make the industry more viable. And it's basic law of economics. I mean, to all of this stuff, and that's what
exactly.
fascinates me.
Exactly. And I think there will still be. It's hard to say what the federal legalization would look like, but I do think there will be a place for the local, and local craft, and there are benefits. There are trade-offs to having all of to have hyper specialized agriculture and everything shipped long, far distances. There are trade-offs to that, and so there's a balance, and I think if there's a better accounting and sort of economic models for understanding those downstream effects, the so-called externalities, and that was somehow priced in or modeled in, then a lot of these problems would just, again, through the sheer economics, be resolved.
Yeah. So talk. Maybe you can talk more about your work and what you're doing now. You had mentioned, you touched on a little bit of the EOS piece, and you've moved on from that. Where are you seeing yourself now in terms of influence and being able to move things in the right direction?
Where I would like the industry to go in particular is a large network of outdoor cultivators integrated into food production, food industry as one of an agricultural crop, organized into a large network through a guild type structure, and that guild would provide essentially what amounts to best practices and a repository of genetics, and in addition to some coordination function, administrative functions like crop planning and demand planning, stuff like that. And then also a big part of this would be a certification to the consumer, right? Kind of like your organic certification, but a few steps above it, certification which would be more integrated than just organic. What organic was before the USDA took it over. So things like sustainability and practices, but also labor practices and how people are treated on farms, right? That would be then integrated into large-scale processor hubs, right? And these processor hubs, like we're building in Poughkeepsie, in Milton, near Poughkeepsie in New York with Hepworth Pura, processor hub, which allows to create the large volume and scale necessary to get to the point where you can then convert all of that agricultural crop into consumer packaged goods, high quality packaged goods.
So a grower can then ship their raw material in, let's just say, a box to Poughkeepsie, and then the folks in Poughkeepsie will take care of the actual packaging, testing, all that. Okay.
Yes, and I think I would imagine that given the size of New York, demographics, these would be regional processor hubs.
Sure.
Right, that would service the cultivators. But again, the cultivators would be organized.
So we're talking like an industry group, a trade group.
Exactly, and really following agricultural economics. We're not reinventing the wheel, right? So like Ocean Spray, right, is
there you go.
Example.
That's a perfect one in Massachusetts on the eastern part of the state, Cape Cod, and
right. So I guess now cannabis in Massachusetts, but it was cranberries was I think the number one agricultural crop, at least if we're maybe milk, but huge crop, right? And so Ocean Spray is an example of a presence with that model, right? And then what they're doing is they are providing that branding and that sort of consumer pull through and communication and again the consistency and understanding
the messaging and
the
lobbying
and the lobbying and so that would be then built through a house of brands that would be pulling through all of this volume integrated, and it would be able to approach the economies of scale and the efficiencies so that your cost per unit would be at a point where it's very, very competitive. When individual growers try to do this on a scale of the individual small business, it's just going to get crushed.
And you have 1,000 people doing it 1,000 different ways,
and just the inefficiencies. And then, of course, even if you're successful, and this is kind of one of the lessons that I learned in EOS Farms. Now, EOS, it's called Farms, not Farm. Farms plural, because this was the model that we were looking to build in Massachusetts. And I still have hope that it's possible, but it got derailed for a number of reasons. But this was the model that we were trying to, the internal core, the brainchild, this was the idea. And it still is, right? And so, what I also learned, though, is trying to do it ourselves. On 100,000 square feet, which is the canopy restriction in both Massachusetts and New York, outdoor, you just simply cannot produce enough to hit the volume and the scale so that your per unit cost is where it needs to be. And then, if you're somehow wildly successful and you've spent all that money on the branding, the marketing, the sales, and you've got the shelf space, if you then can't produce consistently and fulfill the orders when it comes, then you will lose all that shelf space that you had. So to be able to have that consistent inventory, right? And these are the things that that I didn't quite understand how crucially important this stuff was. You could grow the best, you could sell the meaning of life in a cup, and if you can't fulfill the orders, then you're going to lose it. It's just bottom line. And so, I've talked to many cultivators, and they're convinced they're the best cultivator that's ever existed, and they have the best genetics, and they're the best and the firest, and they're the most woman-owned, and they're the most sustainable, and they're most regenerative, and people are just going to come and flock and just know because it's the best. Okay, but there's other aspects that are just mandatory in order to have a successful long-term business. Right. And to have this centralized hub that is creating those scale, that creates that economy, right, gets those efficiencies, and then has the consistency to be able to fulfill orders, to get onto those shelves, and keep those shelves once you got them. You can't do that on the scale of an individual farm.
And this lets farmers be farmers and stick to what they're good at. And
exactly.
I mean, I look at a podcast here. I'm both the host and the producer, and recorded the theme music, and did the website, and it's not fun. And I'm good at a couple of those things, but I'm not a website builder, and I see it. You've got to be able to package and promote it, and they're very, very different skill sets, and to be able to try and do that on your own is a tough go.
And you just and not only if you're a miraculous savant and you can do all those things well, the problem is if you actually are successful and you do them well at the level of an individual farm, let's say of 100,000 square feet, well, then you're going to get to a point where you're not going to be able to scale. You're not going to be able to produce enough. To continue to grow and fulfill. Now, again, maybe the goal is to just be at that scale, but Pareto distribution and basic economics, there's going to be very, very few of those, and ultimately, the more resourced, the ones who are putting the money into the messaging, right? Because objective truth in the corner of the universe might not ever see the light of day, especially when you got huge amount of resources messaging something else.
You were talking about Pareto's Law, 80-20, and to say more about that. And, maybe we can talk more about timeline as well, what your horizon is, and what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think the Pareto distributions tend to show themselves, in more competitive markets, right? Again, unless there's other forces that are, changing that distribution. But, you'll tend to see 20% of operators and producers are going to control 80% of the market, right? And that's where it's going. And the thing too in cannabis is everyone really actually knows that. It's just that the approach to capture that is different. And one approach is lobby politicians and get limited licenses and have a state-imposed monopoly. Right? That's one approach. Now, what I'm proposing is there's an alternative, but this takes a lot more coordination and people alignment, which is maybe more challenging, right? Because I've found, too, a lot of cultivators who are in it for the love of the plant secretly just want to be celebrities, right? So it's not quite the love of the plant.
There's the celebrity chef mentality.
They want to be on IG, right? And they want everyone to look at them.
Right.
And so... that's not really the audience. I'm interested in actual, people who do want to cultivate and also primarily understand agricultural economics and farm economics and what it takes to make a farm work, of which there are many in New York, and then to integrate this into a large scale. And then the idea is hopefully, these processor hubs can be worker owned and start to engage a lot of the sort of distributed ownership models and control models through co-ops and worker ownership and ESOPs and what have you. And so the idea there is that it's understanding the economics, understanding the consolidation, understanding the Pareto distribution, but moving it in the direction of becoming a more distributed ownership model, right, through cooperative ownership. And the problem, too, is I think a lot of people think of distributed ownership as lots of little mom and pops. But again, the economies of scale I don't believe that it's possible. You know, you'll have a lot of people who will start and fail, right, you know, in these small, you know, micro businesses, and then a lot of people who will, you know, ultimately they'll buy themselves a good job, right? They'll have a liquor store, essentially, you know, and a small craft. And if they really love that and that's what they want to do, then fantastic, power to them. But it's going to be highly competitive, very difficult, and the economies of scale, they're just not going to be able to compete with somebody.
Not enough of those folks are going to be able to make it. And,
exactly. Yeah. But if you understand the scale, if you understand the economics driving it, if you actually go to, you know, put the puck, you know, skate to where the puck is going to go, right?
Yes. Yes.
And get there and say, okay, there's going to be these consolidations. Let's put these consolidations into the hands of more people.
Let's meet it head
through
on.
Distributed ownership models of the
and that's the way that you can compete against what could be a corporate industry
and federal, right?
Okay,
you could have a local economy, right? And then of course all the things that come with agricultural and industrial jobs within economies that are suffering, right? In communities that are suffering, that incidentally were destroyed based on the war on drugs. You put these large scale industrial processor hubs back in those communities, and then give the ownership back to the individuals through a distributed ownership model like a co-op or an ESOP, right? Now you're cooking.
What's an ESOP?
ESOP, Employee Stock Option Plan. It's a model used a lot in cannabis because it's actually exempt from taxation, and a huge problem in cannabis is tax. Federal, state, local. And so this ESOP structure is, you know, dual benefit. It's actually, you know, spiritually, it gives actual ownership and equity participation to employees, but it also, because of the ESOP structure and the sort of federal characteristic given to it, you eliminate huge tax liability and free up a lot of, you know, free cash.
Right. So what's the timeline? What do you like? Ideally, you know, how long would this take until this cooperative could be in place where it could, you know, compete at scale?
Well, you know, I mean, Hepworth Pura is building one of them.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
And you know, there's lots of, you know, how it gets from here to there, we'll see. But you know, in a perfect world, 3 years from now, there will be several. You know, 5 years from now, there will be several, and it'll all be integrated.
So the Hepworth is almost the proof of concept in New York State in some respects.
Of the basic business model, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this sort of processor hub integrated with, you know, various cultivators, low-cost outdoor cultivating infrastructure, integrated into a large processor hub, which has then a house of brands that are pulling through, you know, creating that pull-through and that sell-through. And the computer, you know, the consumer facing and you know, B2B facing communication and, you know, messaging.
And so this could be a model for other, I'm not going to say nationwide because every state has their own, but this could be replicated in, you know, its own fashion and,
absolutely,
you know, other states that come on board. Let's say a PA, you know, Virginia, wherever it may
Northeast
be.
that have agriculture, have farmland, have farmers,
right, distressed
farmers that need additional agricultural crops.
I mean, New York State is, you know, Massachusetts is a smaller state, smaller population. I mean, New York has, you know, a lot of folks, you know, think of New York as New York City, but well, it's, you know, got it's upstate is enormous.
It's enormous, yeah. A lot of agricultural land, you know, tens of millions of acres.
Yeah,
and
huge.
And you know, Massachusetts too. 7,700 farms in Massachusetts.
Really?
Yes, almost 8,000 farms in Massachusetts, and you know, and actually, in my opinion, the time is ripe in Massachusetts for this model. And you know, there's rumblings, and a lot of the outdoor growers, you know, we're all very connected, and we communicate, and we have great connections and relationship. And you know, given the basics of the economics and the cost structure and pricing, and you see a lot of the big smart money that was telling me you can't grow outside. They're shutting down indoor capacity because they just simply can't afford to keep the lights on to produce. You know, so it's interesting, and I think it's a model that can be replicated.
So you've had a number of times in your life, in increments, and you were in Sedona for 10 years, and now you moved out to Pittsfield. Where do you see yourself? What's next?
I think number one, this model, I would love to. I mean, if we pull this off, I mean, it would just be something it'd be amazing. Now, I always sort of kind of half joke, but not really. This is more of a stepping stone. I'm very, very interested in the reorganization of human beings into groups. Again, the foundation of our effectiveness and well-being, and guided by the heart mind, if you will, right? So the ability to understand that the human experience is actually as lived in the dynamic, ever-present now. Our models that we mediate the world through, right? The mathematics and the symbolic language that we use is definitely useful, and it's important, and it's instrumental, and it's the foundation of all knowledge in sort of that sense. But the world and the life as lived happens in the flow state, in the ever-present now. And I do believe that all effectiveness and well-being emerges from the ability to stay present, to get into that flow state, and to open up the heart mind, right? That sort of all ethical behavior comes from a sensibility, right? We have innate structures, just like we have innate structures that allow us to learn language, right? It's not a blank slate. We don't just learn all of language and syntax and grammar in 3 years. It's literally impossible. We're not like a large language model where we just get the sum of all knowledge on the internet and then just find and
Spit it out,
spit it back out in patterns, right? We actually have innate structures that allow us to aggregate based on very minimal data inputs, right? Well, the same thing, just like, we have eyeballs. It's an innate structure that allows us to see for certain spectrums of electromagnetic light. And we have legs, certain structures that allow us to walk and run, etc. Well, the heart-mind is an innate structure that allows us to understand, one, how to navigate within groups, and two, how to act ethically. And it's the foundation is compassion. And so ethics is, a study that I find fascinating. And it's very helpful in sort of creating frameworks and structures and political, frameworks in particular. But it's limited, and those models really rarely help us in the actual dynamics of the ever-present now, right? Again, acting in a way that is appropriate, right? Not just ethically, logically sound, if you will. And so really, my hope is that this cannabis it's a microcosm of this concept of using this historical moment in the legalization, the end of prohibition, and connecting it to farms and reintegrating human beings into communities and to the ecology. And this could be a platform, I do believe, truly, of a cultural and spiritual evolution. And that has always kind of been my interest. And I do believe the foundation is the community. But the community, the group being a force multiplier, if you will, of individuals who have trained in the heart mind, the ability to stay present, get into the flow state, open up their compassion and their heart, and integrate within a group. And so there's a lot of, I thought I was talking about this concept, of group integration in a vacuum. You look at the history of the United States, right? All these communities that arose, all the towns, like even throughout, this area, right? You look at like the Shakers and the Oneida communities, and then fast forward to the 60s and 70s, even before that, right? The history is the kibbutz, right? So there's lots of examples of human beings reorganizing into groups to fulfill certain needs, basic economic and historical, cultural, spiritual, whatever the case may be, needs. And I think we're at that point again. And we see a lot of that, right? So don't know if you're familiar with Praxis, which was an organization that essentially, the best way to understand it is looking at the rebuilding of a new city-state from scratch. And it's one way to understand it is it's largely a real estate investment play, but it's focusing on a demand-first approach to construction. So, you look at, like a lot of the retirement communities that were built throughout Arizona and let's call it, even Florida. Like, I don't know if you know the villages in Florida.
Yeah, famous
right?
example.
Yeah. And, Del Webb, right? Arizona. Am I saying that name right? But anyway, all these communities that were built, master planned communities that were built around specific functions, generally retirement in those cases, golf retirement for the villages, built it and then they came, right? This is more building a community in the web, right, in the cloud, and then with that community, then also commitments to basically reintegrate and start a new city-state, right? And this is an idea that I've been thinking about since living at Green Gulch, and I thought I was thinking about this in a vacuum, but then found some really smart people also thinking about this in very sophisticated ways. Balaji is one of them, and he wrote a book called Network State, which I think lays out a lot of. It really starts to clarify and give some teeth to a lot of the concepts and the ideas, and so I'm really interested in those movements and that type, and then really starting, locally, if you will, with my family and friends, and building a group, a community, a tribe, a mutual aid society, right, around shared resources and a shared vision and values, but really all downstream from this integration into the community based on the heart mind, right, compassion and present state awareness, again, effectiveness and well-being. Yeah.
So how could people find out? You've written a lot about this. How can people find out more about you?
Well, I think really what I write primarily to, one, just chronicle it and hopefully share it with my kids and to get my own thoughts clear. So right now I'm moving everything that I've written to Substack, and will continue to do that. And my social media engagement is sparse and not very good, and I try to be very nuanced and balanced, which gets you absolutely no fucking traction in social media. So, at the end of the day, Substack, you always reach out. I'm always interested in talking to people who are interested in talking about these ideas.
Right. All right, Suehiko, It's been a pleasure. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah.
All right, that was great, man.
Yeah, thank you.
We did it.